Did you know that when George Washington died, the British Royal Navy lowered their flags to half-mast on its entire fleet? This week is the state funeral of America's 39th president, Mr. Jimmy Carter. As I've been watching the ceremonies in Georgia and then Washington, D.C., the processions, the honor guards, much sadness and many memories, I became interested in learning about the deaths and funerals of America's presidents. And the more I read, the more I became convinced that I should share them with you. So, in this episode, we won't go through each and every funeral of U.S. presidents. Don't worry, that would take hours. Instead, I'll share with you some highlights and interesting anecdotes. So, stay with me as I peel the history behind the passings and the state funerals of America's presidents. Welcome to History Behind News. I'm Adel Aali, your host. This is not just a history program, and it's not at all a news program. I interview scholars from all over the world, 150 and counting, who distill their many decades of research into an hour conversation to explain to us in rich detail and with fascinating stories how we got to our current moment in history. So my guest scholars help me peel the history behind developments and trends we're told about or should be told about in our news. This episode is going to be different because it's not an interview, and I may end up doing this sort of podcast from time to time where I talk about the history behind news. And there are reasons for doing this without a guest. Sometimes there are just no scholars on a particular topic or no scholars that can weave together several different epochs of our history into one conversation. And sometimes we can't coordinate their participation in my program in a timely manner, i.e. relatively close to news developments. So we'll see how this goes. If you guys like it, let me know. You can comment on my social media, the links for which are in the description. So let's start with George Washington. He died in Mount Vernon, his home in Virginia, at the age of 67 on December 14, 1799. Less than 3 years after he left the president's house in Philadelphia. Notice that I said the president's house. This is when the capital of the United States was in Philadelphia, not in Washington, D.C. In fact, the District of Columbia was being constructed then. Washington didn't want any parades or speeches. In his will, he expressed his wish for a private funeral. Despite this, Congress adjourned, and in all 16 states of our nation, mock funerals were held for Washington. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered a 10-day requiem for Washington's passing. And get this, as I said in the opening, the British Empire, against whom George Washington had fought the 8-year-long War of Independence, ordered the Royal Navy to lower their flags at half-mast on the entire fleet. Now, that's really a sign of respect when your enemy pays you such homage. Another thing that happened after Washington's death, one that I know historians find particularly tragic, is that Martha Washington burned all the letters she exchanged with her husband. She did that to preserve his privacy. As I understand it, only 5 letters survive. John Adams, our second president, died at his home in Quincy, Massachusetts at the age of 90 on July 4, 1826, 25 years after his presidency, and on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the writing of which he was also instrumental. Based on my research, Adams is the 5th longest-lived U.S. president. His longevity is important here. You should take note of it because given that the presidents who lived longer than him, Ford, Bush, Reagan, and now Carter, all lived during an age in which we had better health care in the 20th and 21st century. So for Adams to have lived until the age of 90 in the 18th century, from the 18th to 19th century, let me correct myself, that's a huge achievement. By the way, Adams's family rejected Bostonians' calls to hold his funeral at the State House at the taxpayers' money. Instead, his funeral was held at a church in Quincy Massachusetts, and about 4,000 people attended his funeral. As he was dying, Adams said, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing that Jefferson had died a few hours earlier. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, who was John Adams' vice president, also his rival, and also his friend earlier, died in Monticello, his home, at the age of 83, on the same day as John Adams, July 4, 1826, 17 years after his presidency. He was buried in Monticello in a private funeral. While his epitaph says nothing about his presidency, it does mention this, quote, "author of the Declaration of American Independence," end quote. Interestingly, the U.S. president at the time of his death was John Quincy Adams, the eldest son of John Adams, who died on the same day, as you well know. One last point about Jefferson. He was in debt, so after he died, all of his assets, including his slaves and his estate of Monticello, were sold. A commodore of the U.S. Navy bought Monticello and used his own money to restore it. Later in the 20th century, in the 1920s, Monticello was bought again and turned into a museum and open to the public. William Henry Harrison is the first U.S. president to have died in the White House, and also the first U.S. president to receive a state funeral. It was our 9th president and also the grandfather of our 23rd U.S. president, Benjamin Harrison. He died at the age of 68 on April 4, 1841, exactly 1 month after his inauguration day. By the way, back then, presidential inaugurations were held on March 4th, not on January 20th. This makes Harrison's presidency the shortest presidency in U.S. history. He was buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., which is the only American cemetery of national memory founded before the Civil War. And although Harrison had the first state funeral, it was Lincoln who really had the first national funeral. I'll explain. Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, was the first U.S. president to be assassinated. He died at the age of 56 on April 15, 1865, a month and 11 days after the start of his second term. Lincoln was the first president to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. His casket, along with the casket of Willie, his third son who had died in the White House at the age of 11, some 3 years earlier, traveled on the Lincoln Special Funeral Train for 3 weeks, from Washington, D.C., through a circuitous route to Springfield, Illinois. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered to watch his train in this route. And that's why I say Lincoln's was really the first national funeral, because the train and also the telegraph brought to millions of Americans the first experience of national mourning for a president. Warren Harding, our 29th president, died in San Francisco on his way back from Alaska. He was the first president to visit Alaska, which was then a territory. He died at the age of 57 on August 2, 1923, about 2.5 years into his presidency. Harding's death was a shock to the nation, and it is said that 9 million Americans lined the railroad tracks to watch the train that carried his body from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, and Harvey Firestone were at his funeral, and his casket was adorned with a flower arrangement designed by his widow. William Howard Taft, our 27th president, died at the age of 72 on March 8, 1930, some 17 years after his presidency. He was the first U.S. president and the first Supreme Court justice to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The interesting point that I want to share about Taft is that in 1921, 8 years after he left the White House, he became the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, and he remained in that role for almost 9 years, until a month before his death. Because of this, his former colleagues, Justices of the United States Supreme Court, were honorary pallbearers at his funeral. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president, died in Warm Springs, Georgia at the age of 63 on April 12, 1945. This is less than 3 months into his 4th term. The only thing I'll say about FDR is that he didn't have a state funeral because they thought it was not appropriate to have a big ceremony when many Americans were still fighting the war. World War II, that is. John F. Kennedy, our 35th president, as we all know, was assassinated in Dallas. He died at the age of 46 on November 12, 1963, about 2.5 years into his presidency. What I'll say about JFK is that his funeral was the most famous, obviously because of his own popularity, his young age, and his young family, but also because it was the first state funeral on television. It was covered on TV for 70 hours, non-stop. I'll end this podcast with this. Both Harry Truman's and Richard Nixon families decided against the state funeral, even though they were eligible for it. If you have any comments, please post them to my social media accounts. And before I let you go, I want to tell you this. This Friday, I have a professor from the University of Greenland to talk about Greenland, its relationship with the United States, and why Donald Trump Jr. was there this week.